All right, guys, I am. All right, here we go. All right, here we go. Okay, yeah, I got it. Hey, Amy, let's see if I'm going to try to get you so you can talk here. Ooh, let's see. Okay. All right. Hey, Amy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All righty. Okay, I'm going to see if
But I can't, you can't see me. I don't have like a video control. I don't know if you need that or not.
yeah, I'm looking to see if I can promote you to a panelist here. So let me see if I can figure that one out. We do have people joining us. We've already have them coming on already. So that's great, guys. Welcome. I'm super excited to talk to you guys about PCOS. In an approach to aging, I love to talk about PCOS because there's a comprehensive way to approach it that's really cool that's going to help you in a lot of ways. So if you can hear me, just kind of say hello. I'm going to see if I can get Amy's video working here. So let me just give me just a second to do that. Okay, so Amy, I promoted you as a panelist, so I should probably be able to see you. Hey, there we are. Okay, good.
Hello.
All right, so we have members of your clan joining us here. We
Hi,
still have
David.
we still have another 4 or 5 minutes to go. So wow, your background looks so great. Wow.
Well, I tidied up for our call. There was lots of papers everywhere, but
Oh my goodness.
I'm
My
usually not
background's
that neat.
my background's rather boring. I just jump into my wife's office here and just go with it. But yeah, I want to just go into your little office there and I want to read a book. It's so
Oh
relaxing.
gosh, I got so many great experts that we both know that have written books. Super excited about well, I just got Dr. Jolene Brighton's new book. That's
Oh yes.
gosh, what's the date today? Oh, it's out today, the 28th. So
Oh, that's
now
awesome.
everybody can get it. Beyond the Pill, it's called. But
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah.
Well, okay, so we still have, guys, another 5 minutes or so until we get going. So if you want to go grab a pen and piece of paper, I do highly recommend it. Some people like to take notes on their computer, which is cool, but having a pen and paper is good if you just want to jot something down real quick that you just might, want to check into. The goal for today is really to teach you a comprehensive approach to aging, but with a focus on PCOS. And you can see, I'll show you exactly how you can do this. So if you're out there suffering from PCOS, my goal is to teach you a lot about how we approach it as anti-aging doctors. Um, yes,
And
Amy.
yeah, so I just want to say I saw your slides last night, and you all are going to learn so much. This is such a treat and a gift to our community from Dr. Allen. I had Dr. Allen on my podcast. It's episode 99. So if you haven't heard that, you're going to want to go back because I'm sure you'll glean some other tidbits that we aren't talking about in the webinar. But after we recorded that webinar, he offered to do this training for us. And I'm just so grateful. He's an emergency medicine doctor. He works in the ER. He has a business called Your Lab Works, which he'll talk about a little bit as well. He's a busy guy. So I'm just grateful you took some time out of your schedule to be with us today.
Oh yeah, no, I like talking about PCOS because I do think that it's sort of an under-recognized condition, and quite frankly, there's probably a lot of people out there that have it just don't know it, and it's great to talk about it and intercept it and reverse it because it really will save people's lives down the line. And so I'm super excited to talk about it. I just can't wait for the next 3 minutes to go by. So we got about 3 more minutes before we start. I try to start right on time to give people the chance we have people joining us right now. Just want to make sure that we not waste your guys' time. We provide super high value for you. This will be recorded, by the way. So if anybody wants to watch this later, certainly be able to do it. And Amy, I'll give you the MP4 so that you can, send it out to your people whenever you want to.
Okay, great. Yeah, Diana just asked a question. Does PCOS affect postmenopausal women? And PCOS is a condition that affects us from puberty right up to postmenopause. And a lot of people think it's just an issue for women in their reproductive years, and that's really a fallacy. And Diana, take a look at PCOSdiva.com because we have some content about PCOS and menopausal women and postmenopausal women. And you can look there for some great content.
Yeah, this is okay. This is great. So we have Cass from Florida. That's awesome. Nancy saying this is exciting. Very good. Diana, all right. You just answered her question. And then Cass, I answered that question a minute ago. This is going to be recorded. So if you do have to step away, we don't recommend it. But if you do, we will send out a recording for you. Okay, good. So yeah, this is great. Yeah, so it looks like somebody did take the Dutch test, and so we're going to be talking a little bit about the Dutch test and so on. And here we go. So Marie's talking about how we can, she was excited to learn how we can order labs ourselves and advocate for ourselves. That's awesome. Okay, guys. All right, so we have 1 minute to go. 1 minute to go. So I'm just going to like end up sharing the slide deck here. But Amy, I'll let you kind of like, welcome the group and so on, and then we'll go to the slide deck.
Yeah, so I'm just so happy that you all are here and you're taking time out of your day to listen to this. It's going to be super informative. And as I mentioned, Dr. Allen was on the podcast 99 just recently. And there was something that you mentioned, Dr. Allen, that really resonated with me when I went back to listen to the podcast. You said, if you're an active participant in your health, everything just goes better. You're going to have better outcomes. And I can tell you that's so true for me. When I was really suffering from PCOS, I was very passive in my care. The doctor, usually the nurse would follow up and say, yeah, your blood sugar is just fine, or your testosterone's a little elevated. And I really didn't, I took that for face value. I didn't really know what that meant. I never really saw my lab results. And I just accepted that that's what it was. And it wasn't until I really understood that I can be an active participant. I can understand that labs that I need to ask for. I can understand the ranges and values. So I really can take better control and be a better advocate for myself. And so that's really what I want for you. And I'm just thrilled that Dr. Allen Hopkins is here to teach us more just how to be, I call it being a diva at the doctor. So thank you again, Dr. Allen, and I'm gonna just throw it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and get started here. So let me just start with my PowerPoint here. We can share. Okay, that's good. Guys, just give me a second to get to my PowerPoint. All right. So can everybody see that there? Let me just play my slideshow from the start. Okay. So oh, yeah, this is a great picture of you, Amy, by the way. Okay. So just a quick little background about myself so you guys know kind of where I come from. So I am a medical doctor. I earned my MD degree from Loma Linda University Medical Center. The cool thing about training there is they do believe in a comprehensive approach to a person. And when I say a person, I really mean a person and not a disease. So often we as doctors are caught in saying 79-year-old guy with colon cancer and so on, and we just approach them as if they were a disease. But Loma Linda really taught us really well to approach people as people. And we, we'll say, hey, he's a 79-year-old guy named Jim. He's got a family. He's got 4 kids. He's got great-grandchildren and so on. And he just happens to have the unfortunate diagnosis of colon cancer. And here's how we're going to approach it. So the disease is really secondary to the person, which I really loved. I put alpha, omega, alpha on here because people wanted to know, did you do good in medical school, whatever. That just means I finished in the top 10% of my class, which is pretty much irrelevant since that was over 20 years ago. But anyway, so I'm a board-certified emergency medicine doctor. I work currently at the University of Texas and teach in the Dell Medical School here in Austin in the Department of Surgery and Perioperative Care. A number of years ago, I went and did a fellowship in anti-aging medicine through A4M. And from that, I got hired as a consultant for a company called Biophysical. They did advanced biomarker testing for the Oprah Winfrey Show and NBC's Biggest Loser. And so I got to learn from a lot of mentors in the field of advanced testing, which was really pretty awesome. Over the past few years, I noticed in the marketplace something that was going on significant, and that was more cost was being shifted to the consumer. And so, what's happening is we're all now way more responsible for our healthcare dollars. And relative to lab work, what I found was that many people now have very high deductibles of $5,000 or even more, and they've lost a lot of the co-insurance for labs. So it used to be once you met your deductible on lab work, your insurance company would pay 80% of the cost of labs. Now that number is typically about 50%. And so lab tests can be quite expensive. And so my idea was to start a direct access platform where I could use national contracts with companies to help the consumers get cheaper lab tests outside of the insurance market. And that's a company, it's called Your Lab Work, and it's really yourlabwork.com. So guys, I want you to, kind of hit up the chat box as we're going through this. Amy will pay attention to it, so I'm looking at the slides, but if there are questions, feel free to ask them. We do want to make this a learning thing. And Amy, of course, if you want to comment, just feel free to step in. I have the tendency just to talk, so people just need to, I'm totally fine with being interrupted if people don't understand something. So, okay, so I'm going to take your guide at PCOS Diva, your guide to lab testing, and I'm going to throw it on my anti-aging platform. So this is the way we approach every single person who comes into my private clinic when we talk about how can I age well. In the middle of this circle are all the non-modifiable factors that we're given. So we're born a certain gender, and of course we can't stop our chronological age from advancing. We got certain genetics, we come from a certain ethnic background. These are the things that we, have trouble modifying. Outside of this black circle, though, are all the key systems that we really need to look at, and we can look at through advanced biomarker testing. Cholesterol, and I noticed you have the basic lipid panel on your lab guide. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an advanced lipid panel and why that's important so that people can understand that. And then if we look at the bottom right, insulin dynamics, this really is relevant to PCOS because we check fasting insulin levels. And we do believe that insulin is the primary driver of most cases of PCOS, insulin resistance. And that goes along with, the increased risk for prediabetes and diabetes and so on. So there are blood tests that we can check for these. And then, of course, hormone imbalances, extremely relative to PCOS because we're going to see higher than normal testosterone levels. We're going to see the LH and FSH ratios change. And then we're also really going to need to think about checking other things, the thyroid in particular, because that can be a cause of lots of problems. Now, the hot topic, at least in anti-aging medicine right now, and functional medicine, is inflammation. And there's been a lot of research that's been done fairly recently about inflammation. So I'm going to teach you about the chronic inflammatory marker CRP. Really important for us to look at because if your CRP is elevated, it does increase risk for lots of problems. Not only increased risk for strokes and heart attacks, but also autoimmune diseases and even cancer. The body cancer in a highly inflammatory environment. And then those are my 4 pillars of health. And the 5th one is nutrition. Super important. And you can see on the outside here, checking these certain things, your vitamin D and B12 and so on. Super important. And the way we eat, super important. The type of nutraceuticals we take, super important. And if we do all these things, and if we look into all these areas, it ends up being quite a comprehensive approach to PCOS. But I'm just telling you, it's a comprehensive approach to aging well. Not only just PCOS. So by having PCOS, it gives us an opportunity to look and see how well we're aging in general and how we can actually age better. On the outside of the circle, I like to explain to people that on the left are the things that we can really sort of focus in on in a very natural way. We all can sleep better. We want to at least sleep 7.5 hours a night. If we don't sleep well, that can lead to insulin resistance, again, PCOS. Stress, we want to be able to manage our stress. Of course, smoking, that increases risk for lots of things, and so we don't like to have smoking around if we can do away with it. Seasonal allergies, again, interferes with sleep a lot of the times. Social dynamics, if our family is not engaged in how we're going to change our nutrition and our behavior, that can be a problem. So we have to sort of think about our approach in our own family situation. And then having a weight loss plan for most people is a pretty good idea since about 70% of us are either overweight or in the obese category here in the United States. And then physical activity, really important actually for PCOS because as we build more muscle cells or myocytes, we're going to actually improve the function of our insulin. And that's really what we want. If we don't pay attention to all of these areas, then what ends up happening is everything to the right side of the outer ring of the circle. And this is stuff we're seeing more than we've ever seen before. So we're seeing more diabetes than we've ever seen before. We're seeing more autoimmune disease than we've seen before. consequently more cancer, earlier strokes and heart attacks, and so on and so on. And so the idea here is that if we take a very comprehensive approach to whether you're an elite athlete with no medical problems, or if you have PCOS, or maybe you have something like metabolic syndrome where you have lots of problems, if we can apply the same principle of this aging circle in the way we approach things, we're not going to miss stuff. And so that's what I like about looking at this in a comprehensive way. And it's specifically applicable to PCOS. All right, so our objectives over the next little while is talk about the PCOS labs to monitor. And Amy, you have a great PCOS guide to labs, and it is very upfront on the website, and I love it because it talks about the different markers and what they test and what we're really looking for. So it's super helpful for people. So I do recommend everybody go to her site and download those and take a look at them, just because they're just such a great guide. We're going to talk about key markers for insulin resistance. In other words, how can you tell if you have a problem, with insulin? Because the problem with insulin is it's a fat fertilizer. When it's real high, really difficult to lose weight. And also, not many people know this, you actually will change the way you make cholesterol. And this is why people who have insulin resistance syndrome end up having a higher risk of stroke and heart attack, is because you literally change the way you're making your cholesterol molecules. Instead of the light, fluffy kind that we all want, you tend to make the small, dangerous kind when you have high insulin. And so, it's just good to know about, because as you reverse the insulin problem, you can actually reverse your risk for having these early events. We're also going to talk about key nutrients and the genetic test that you need if you're trying to conceive, just so you know about it. And of course, we want to avoid inflammation. And unfortunately, insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes, they all cause inflammation due to metabolic disturbance. So we really want to avoid inflammation, because inflammation, again, is not good for our body. We also have to think about the mimickers, in other words, the things that we might miss if we don't look at this in a comprehensive way. And the most common thing, particularly in women, is thyroid testing and having hypothyroidism due to an autoimmune condition. That's the most common here in the United States. About over 20 million women are suffering from it. And many women actually don't know, because they're not getting the proper testing, or maybe they've never been tested. We're also going to address the latest in hormone testing. We're going to talk a little bit about Dutch and so on. And then Amy has a special offer for all of you guys to get your own testing done. Because now with direct access, you can go online and order your own tests in 46 states. There are four states that don't allow direct access testing, and they're New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Maryland. And sort of the way it works is you go online, you order what tests you want. Our doctors that actually work with us will actually order the test for you. They review the results to make sure there's not a panic value. Say if you had sort of kidney disease and your potassium was real high and that was sort of an emergency condition, they would contact you. Otherwise, we just give you your results and we ask you to follow up with your doctor. But it's a way to put the power back into the consumer's hands, potentially saving them significant amount of money and giving them the opportunity to be an active participant in their health. All right, so now let's talk about PCOS. Does anybody know when PCOS was first described? I don't know if anybody knows or not. I'm just going to throw that out there. I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So PCOS was first described in 1844, and it seems like a long time ago. So how do they describe this? Well, what they did is they were doing autopsies on women, and they found this abnormal structure to their ovaries, and they saw it over and over again in different people, and so they just described it. It wasn't until years later that there was an understanding that it was a metabolic issue. And to this day, it's still somewhat controversial of where the problem occurs. But it's thought that insulin resistance is the cause in up to 95% of all cases of PCOS. And the thing is, you don't have to be overweight to have insulin resistance. You could just have a genetic inability to actually have insulin work well. So insulin's super important. It's made by the pancreas, and its job is to bring sugar into each one of our cells. It's also responsible for the growth of our body. So it triggers a bunch of growth factors in every one of our cells. And so it's real important that we actually get insulin. It does a great job. But when you have high levels of insulin circulating in your bloodstream and it's not working properly, it interferes with this thing called gonadotropin releasing hormone that's released in a fashion like the Morse code, the dot, 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 kind of, that's how it's released. It screws up the release of this Morse code, and it kind of confuses the pituitary gland. And the pituitary starts making more and more LH, which is luteinizing hormone, at the expense of follicle stimulating hormone. And what that does is that tells the ovaries to take cholesterol and chop it up into testosterone instead of estrogen. And so what ends up happening is, because of the insulin, we end up making more testosterone than we're supposed to. And that screws everything up. It causes us to be moody. It causes us to, have issues with our periods. It causes us to, of course, with a high insulin, we have trouble losing weight. And so there's a lot of different issues that PCOS causes. So the idea is to address the most common cause, which is insulin resistance, and therefore maybe we can reverse all the other things that we don't like. Women don't like to have high levels of testosterone, and in some women it can cause hair growth and skin changes and all these sort of things that people don't like. All right, so the first thing we want to think about when we're talking about this is sugar problems, because insulin, if it's not working well, sugar can build up in the bloodstream. And so how do you know? Maybe you've never been tested, but you're thirsty all the time, you're urinating all the time, maybe you've got some blurry vision, you feel tired. We really worry about diabetes if you have these symptoms. Why? Because when your blood sugar gets up to 250, your kidneys can no longer keep up, and they start spilling water with all the sugar, and that causes you to be in a state of dehydration all the time. And also the sugar molecules then can attach to proteins in your back of your eye, and that causes you to have the blurry vision. That's why a lot of diabetics will complain that their vision's not so good, and then they're thirsty all the time and they're urinating all the time. And of course that makes them tired when you're in this constant state of dehydration. So if you have these obvious signs, of course we're gonna worry about you having diabetes, and you just need to get checked, and we'll show you how to do that. It's very easy. If you have low blood sugar, you can have lack of focus, you can be anxious and shaky and sweaty and moody and so on. And so that can be a sign for some people that they're having low blood sugar. So sometimes insulin works too well, and it causes the blood sugar to go too low. Premenopausal women, of course, they can have acne and irritability, missed periods. This really is PCOS in a lot of women. Trouble with weight loss because of the insulin being super high. Postmenopausal women still have the same problems. They have really high levels of insulin, makes it really hard for them to lose that belly fat, and they can even go on to have significantly more hot flashes. There are many consequences to insulin resistance, and that is, if you have insulin resistance, you're at much higher risk of going on to develop prediabetes and diabetes. So that's right. So if you have PCOS, you do have an increased risk for developing diabetes. So you need to know about that, and that should be a motivator for you to try to reverse the problems with PCOS. And here's the other interesting thing that we found, is that PCOS patients will actually develop diabetes at a faster rate than a normal person would with insulin, just insulin resistance. So as you have PCOS and all the findings of PCOS, and they've done studies on this, they tend to go on to diabetes faster. So there is some urgency to reversing PCOS. There's also a higher risk of stroke and heart attack, and I'm going to show you why. And that's really why, is because of chronic inflammation that people get with PCOS. And here's a thing that not a lot of people know, is that if you have PCOS, your offspring are much more likely to develop diabetes. And that is because we learn about insulin resistance in utero. In fact, the baby inside of you, if you have problems with gestational diabetes and even insulin resistance, can have an 8-fold increased risk for developing diabetes, just because you were in that state during your pregnancy. So it is super important to know about and to think about, because not only does it affect you, but it can actually affect your children. And you've worked so hard to get to the point where you can conceive, and if they don't monitor you closely enough, you can actually put your child at risk. Insulin resistance here to the left causes a lot of different changes in your body. I talked about how you make cholesterol differently, and that's the small dense LDL. LDL is lousy cholesterol. And so you tend to make more small dense lousy cholesterol. You tend to have more increased risk for blood clots, lower good cholesterol, and of course you can develop diabetes at a fast rate. People tend to have high triglycerides in their blood, which are atherogenic or disease causing. And then of course they have trouble losing weight because of the real high insulin levels. When you gain weight, that actually puts you at risk for developing high blood pressure, because your heart has to pump a little bit harder to get all of that blood flow to all the extra tissue that you have. And so the idea here is that by addressing the insulin resistance, we can actually take all these risks away that are in the middle, and therefore prevent you from having an early problem with a heart attack or stroke. And again, PCOS occurs at any age. And so the idea here is that as we get older, just because we get out of the childbearing age, it doesn't mean that PCOS goes away. You continue to have insulin resistance throughout your life, which again can go into diabetes, and then that can cause increase in risk for all these sort of things. So
And
you're at
Dr.
risk.
Allen, I'm just going to
Yeah.
jump in quick. I just want everybody to know that there's so much hope in helping increase insulin sensitivity through lifestyle change. And that's really at the crux of my message with PCOS Diva, and really, what my book, Healing PCOS, is all about. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Allen's not going to be addressing that today, but I just want you to know that there is so much that you can do.
Yeah, I get super excited about this topic in general because natural things can work very well to reverse insulin resistance. And if people understand what they're doing and the reason why they're doing it, and they see the results from it, particularly as they see the test values change over time, it gives them extra motivation to keep doing those very difficult lifestyle changes. But it's super important to understand why we're doing stuff. And by the way, just so you know, when it comes to lab testing, I never recommend anyone get a blood test done unless they're willing to do something about the result. Otherwise, they're kind of just wasting their time. So if you're out there and you're kind of thinking, oh, this is nice to know about, and but you're really not willing to make some difficult changes, there's no real reason to do the blood testing, in my estimation. I mean, otherwise you're just going to do it and you're not going to be willing to take the steps. So blood test is super good in preventative medicine when we want to prevent something from happening and reverse it. But we have to be an active participant in it. I want to talk a little bit about prediabetes so you understand. Insulin resistance is the first sign that we see on the road to diabetes. But before we hit diabetes, many of us will go into this pre-diabetic state. And this is really where our blood sugar is higher than normal, but not quite high enough to call diabetes. And we used to think of this as sort of a benign state. In other words, what did it really matter? You'd go to your doctor and they would say, well, you need to lose weight and exercise. Well, we've come to know that it carries a big risk just having prediabetes. In fact, we've actually measured people's volume of their pancreas as they go through prediabetes. You lose actually 50% of your pancreas as you go through this prediabetic stage, and 80% of the efficiency. You do have an increased risk for certain types of cancers and a markedly increased risk for stroke and heart attack. Because again, you start to generate inflammation and you start to generate the small dense cholesterol, and then you have a high sugar environment. Even though it's not quite a diabetic sugar environment, it's a high sugar environment. So again, that's the triad that causes heart disease and strokes, is inflammation, small dense cholesterol, and then having that sugar that's just a little too high. As you go into diabetes, the risk for stroke and heart attack gets higher, as does the risk for cancers. So prediabetes in and of itself is not just sort of this sort of benign thing. When we see prediabetes, we really like to reverse it. Unfortunately, we're seeing this more and more. If you look at this little graph here, at the bottom is the year and projected out through 2050, and this is the percent increase. And this is from an article here that was looking at the increased rates that we're seeing with sugar problems. So you can see the green line is the general, the working age population. So that's how many are in the working population. The general population is in the yellow line. So we're projected to increase our population rates over time. However, take a look and see what type 2 diabetes is doing. It's just taken off. I mean, it's just shooting way, way up there. And it's predicted that by the year 2050, 35% of us will have type 2 diabetes. Again, this is going to totally wreak havoc on our healthcare system because diabetes still remains the #1 cause of kidney failure here in the United States, the #1 cause of blindness, and the #1 cause of amputations. Those are all very expensive things for healthcare to take care of, particularly when it comes to dialysis for kidney failure and so on. So the idea here is that if you have PCOS, you have a higher risk for going on to develop diabetes, and you're not alone. There's many people out there. And this is why I'm super passionate about it, because I spent years being a medical director for a company called Prediabetes Centers, where all we did was reverse prediabetes. All right, so let's talk about sugar metabolism real quick. Fasting insulin. This is the so-called insulin-resistant syndrome when your insulin levels start going really high. I like to see lower levels of insulin for people, as long as they don't have diabetes. Again, once you have diabetes, your blood sugar starts shooting really high because you're not making insulin anymore. Remember, your pancreas is, most of it's died during that pre-diabetic state. So once you get to diabetes, you're almost kind of way behind the 8 ball. And so this is why if you do have diabetes and you've been told you have diabetes, we want to get your A1C down quickly and we want to get your blood sugar under control quickly. Because the longer that we leave it high, the more destruction is going to happen to your pancreas. So there's quite a bit of urgency now in the way we approach prediabetes and early diabetes, like we've never seen before. The old way of doing things was we would start you on metformin, after you had diabetes and your A1C was above 7, and then that would work okay for a year or two, and then we would start you on a second medicine. That might work fine for a year or two, and then you would go on insulin for the rest of your life. That was the old way. The new way is we identify who's at risk and we treat you super aggressively. I had some people on 3 different medications in pre-diabetes, and we would treat them for 6 months or a year, and then they wouldn't be on anything for years. So the idea is we intercept it early, we treat it early, we revert it back to normal, we get the pancreas back to where it's working normally, the insulin's normal, the pressure's off of it, and that buys people significant amounts of time. If you have bad genetics, in other words, if your mother had diabetes and your father had diabetes, it'd be even higher risk. So genetics plays a huge role in it, along with your lifestyle. So we look at fasting insulin. So less than 2 is optimal. Fasting glucose, I like it to be 70 to 85. That's optimal. Less than 100 is considered normal. We all tend to go a little bit higher as we get older. Pancreas doesn't work quite as well. Pre-diabetes is 100 to 125, and then diabetes is above 125 blood sugar. The A1C, the way this difference is, this is a very stable measurement of your blood sugar. This measures the percent of your red blood cells that have a sugar molecule attached to them. And our red blood cells last for about 90 days in our circulation. So when we measure it, it's a pretty stable measurement. We like to see optimal, less than 5.4% on your A1C. Normal is considered less than 5.7%. Pre-diabetes is 5.7 to 6.4%, and then diabetes is above 6.5% or equal to. So the idea here is that most people who have PCOS only have high levels of insulin. And then it's later that they go on to develop high levels of sugar, and then later, within a few months, high levels of A1C. And that's how the disease progresses: high insulin, high sugar, high A1C. And so wouldn't you like to know when the earliest time is that you have a problem? And that would be by measuring fasting insulin. The problem is nobody really measures fasting insulin. They just don't know about it, so they don't test it. When I say nobody, I mean general allopathic medicine doesn't tend to look at insulin. Super important when it comes to PCOS, though. Insulin-resistant syndrome is also very problematic when it comes to weight loss, especially after menopause. Anytime you have high levels of circulating insulin, it's just not good for your body. We consider it to be a fat fertilizer. The blood test, when you do it, will show very high levels of insulin. You may or may not have high blood sugars yet, though. So again, if you just have a high insulin and your blood sugars and A1C levels are normal, just know that you have a significant opportunity to prevent yourself from going into prediabetes and diabetes. If you do control your blood sugar, you may improve your hot flashes as you're going through that stage of your life. And again, insulin-resistant syndrome is the #1 cause of PCOS. And so we do see tests like high fasting insulin. We generally see high testosterone levels because remember I talked about how the ratios between LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, they get screwed up, right? Because of insulin. So insulin really is thought to screw up the brain signaling down to the ovary, and that ovary just takes that cholesterol and makes more testosterone. And therefore we stop having periods, or we have abnormal periods and abnormal bleeding. But if we do the blood test, we're going to see high insulin, we tend to see high testosterone, and then we tend to see this abnormal ratio between these releasing hormones from the brain. All right, Amy, here's where I get a chance to talk about cholesterol. Now, on your guide, you like for people to look at a basic lipid panel or a standard lipid panel, which is good, particularly when it comes to nutrition. The way that I use this is I look at triglycerides. If somebody's triglycerides are really high, chances are they're eating a lot of carbs. If you eat a lot of carbs, that's really bad for insulin resistance. So we like to see people's triglycerides optimal, which is less than 100. So if I tell someone, hey, you need to eat less carbs, I will monitor their triglycerides over time, and that's how I catch them. If their triglycerides are high, I'll say, come on, what's going on? Oh, yeah, doc, I'm sorry. I was eating all this cake and ice cream and so on. Triglycerides are a really good measurement. So you may say, well, why are triglycerides a good measurement? So the idea here is that when we eat sugar, it's stored in 3 primary locations. It's stored in the liver, but it's stored as a substance called glycogen, which is sugar molecules. And then it's also stored in our muscle cells, and it's stored as glycogen there as well. But on our fat, in our belly fat, it's stored as free fatty acids, not glycogen. 3 free fatty acids hooked together are called triglycerides. And so what happens is when our liver gets full and our muscles get full and then our belly fat gets full, we start to develop insulin resistance. And we develop insulin resistance in our liver and our muscle and in our belly fat. And so the thing that I worry about is when all these compartments are full, because the liver can only handle so much glycogen, and then it's full. The muscle only handles so much, and then it's full. But guess what happens with belly fat? It can just keep expanding. And so it can handle large amounts of free fatty acids. And therefore, it's a never-ending compartment. And this is why, as we start to take control of the carbs in our life, we want to see those triglycerides go down, because they're really the end result of all your tanks being full. All right, so that's what I use for the standard lipid panel. These other things that you see, cholesterol, 150 is the perfect number on that. But total cholesterol really doesn't tell us what type we have. And we want to know, do we have good, which is HDL cholesterol, or do we have bad, which is LDL cholesterol? And so the fasting lipid panel, or basic lipid panel, or standard lipid panel, all called the same thing that you're looking at right here, it gives us this limited amount of information. Now, if you have PCOS and you have insulin resistance, I really think that people should get an advanced cholesterol panel, and here's why. These are the different subtypes of cholesterol that we look at. And I just want to point out a couple things here. If you focus on LDL, we're right there in the middle, these little green balls. You can see that smaller LDL is really what we're talking about here with insulin resistance. When you have insulin resistance, you don't form the larger LDL molecules that are less dangerous. You tend to form the smaller ones. And that's the ones all the way to the left here. You can see they're just smaller green circles. And that's what insulin resistance does, and that's why it increases your risk for having strokes and heart attacks, is because you're making more smaller ones. Now, when you do a basic lipid panel, it doesn't tell us if you're making smaller ones or not. And really importantly, it doesn't tell us whether or not you have a genetic Lp(a). So you see right in the middle of this graph, Lp(a) stands for lipoprotein A. It's a genetically modified LDL cholesterol variant. It's given to you by your parents, either one or both. And the problem is nobody knows about this and nobody's talking about it. But it's super important to know whether or not you have lipoprotein A or not. Why? Because it increases your risk of having a stroke or heart attack significantly. So we compare it to smoking a pack a day of cigarettes for about 30 years. Same risk as if you genetically had just lipoprotein A. Another interesting facet, 1.2 million heart attacks in the United States every single year. 120,000 are thought to be due to lipoprotein A alone. So again, 20% of the US population has lipoprotein A, and we don't even know it. So it is important for people to know. So in order to know, we do something called advanced cholesterol panel, and that will tell us. So here's just another graph. I'm telling you the latest stuff that's coming out right now. This is from the Journal of Cardiology. This is a study from 2018 that looked at lipoprotein A. The cardiologists are now starting to spend more time on this because they're realizing the significant damage it's doing to people. The number one cause of death is cardiovascular disease. And so how can we prevent it? Well, doing advanced testing can identify people that are higher risk. The problem is insurance companies don't want to pay for this. Why? Well, I've battled them about it, and they've said, well, Dr. Hopkins, it doesn't really matter. You just need to put a person on a statin. Well, the problem is statins can increase lipoprotein A. So statins maybe in the right person are good, but in the wrong person, maybe not so good. And so this is, again, an understanding of a person's whole situation should govern whether or not to put them on a statin. So why am I going to put a person on a statin when I don't even know what their lipoprotein A is in the first place? So the idea here is that 1 in 5 of us have it here in the United States. But look, if you're of African origin, your chance of having it is 30%. And if you're from Asia, your chance of having it is significantly less at 10%. We used to think, well, hey, what are the Asians doing right over there? They have a different diet. They don't have as much cardiovascular disease. What are they doing right? Well, if we looked at Lp(a) alone, look, they have half as much of it as we have here in the United States. And so there is a real significance to lipoprotein A. Cardiologists are now recognizing it. It's not being tested because it's not covered by insurance. It's not a super expensive test. And I advocate for people to get tested. I tested it in my own family. I found it in my wife, and I found it in her father. I found it in one of the healthiest nurses in our clinic. And her mother had a heart attack at age 47. Found it in her. That was the cause of it. She had no other risk factors. That same nurse, I sent her for coronary calcium scoring. She ended up having a lesion in her left anterior descending artery called the widowmaker artery in the exact same place that her mother had a stent put in. And so the idea here is that if we do recognize it, we can follow people more closely. So again, this is not yet related to PCOS, but yet it is because it's part of an advanced lipid panel that I really advocate for all people with PCOS, because I'm looking for two things here when I look at the advanced cholesterol panel. The first thing is all the way at the bottom. This is what it is. At the bottom, you see the lipoprotein A. This was actually a doctor that came and saw us, and his number is 325, super high. So lipoprotein A increases your risk for having a blood clot. It increases your risk for having stroke and heart attack significantly. So it is something we have to know about. It's very difficult to treat. It's a genetic thing. But what we can do is manage everything else, and we'll know that we need to watch this more carefully. We need to be followed closely by a cardiologist, make sure we're getting our screening tests done, make sure we have everything else under control. Well, with PCOS and how it relates to PCOS is, if you have PCOS, you likely have insulin resistance. If you have insulin resistance, you likely are forming the small dense cholesterol. And on advanced lipid panel, we can look at that. So if you look at LDL small, which is the small dense cholesterol, this guy's number is also very, very high. And so he has the small dense kind. And unfortunately for him, he doesn't have very much good cholesterol that's the most efficient, called HDL large. So I have a whole presentation, a lecture on advanced lipid panel that I'm happy to give your group at some time. But the idea here is, if you have insulin resistance due to PCOS, you're much more likely to have small dense cholesterol. And you may or may not have lipoprotein A. But you can find all of this out quite simply by doing an advanced cholesterol panel. And it's easy to get, and I advocate for people doing it at least one time in their life so they can make sure they don't have lipoprotein A. If you have insulin resistance, you're going to find out if you have the small dense cholesterol. That can be changed, by the way. So as you fix the insulin resistance, you can also fix the small dense cholesterol problem and take away your risk. So again, PCOS is awesome as we talk about it relative to aging well, because it includes every single area that we look at in a comprehensive approach. If you look down to the right, it really starts with a fasting insulin problem, which leads to metabolic disturbance, which leads to inflammation due to the metabolic disturbance as measured by your high sensitivity CRP. The insulin resistance itself will change you into a small dense cholesterol pattern, and you oftentimes see high triglycerides from excessive carb intake, and you can measure that with an advanced lipid panel. We look at vitamin D. It's super important for insulin function, because we think that at adequate levels of vitamin D, your insulin actually works better. And so it's important to know your vitamin D status. And then finally, down to the left, again, high insulin level interferes with that releasing hormone from the brain, causes you to chop up testosterone, or chop up cholesterol into testosterone. So you'll see higher levels of testosterone, and you'll see this abnormal ratio between your LH and FSH. So if you apply the aging well wheel to approach it with PCOS, you can see abnormalities in every single area. And as you fix it, you'll see all these abnormalities start to go away if you fix it in the right way. So I want to focus on some natural things. So nutrient deficiencies do impact PCOS. Vitamin D, it's super important for you to be optimal. My optimal levels are between 60 to 80 because that's where research shows that you get all the benefits of vitamin D. I've even convinced my son of this. He's 17 years old. He's an athlete. Vitamin D, did you know, studies have shown you actually build more fast-twitch muscle fibers with vitamin D levels being above 60. So that's cool. He can get even faster than he is. And a lot of Olympic athletes take it for that reason. People also take it to lower problems with depression and psychiatric illness. It's big time. We're learning more about this for psychiatric disease, trying to prevent people, trying to keep people stable by giving them adequate levels of vitamin D. Same thing for seizures. We think it helps actually lower the amount of seizures that a person has at baseline. And now we're talking about insulin sensitivity relative to PCOS. We do feel like it improves insulin. Also, it tends to lower the risk of certain types of cancers. A lot of good research around that. So vitamin D of itself functions more like a hormone than it does a vitamin. It's really important that people know what their vitamin D is and to replace it adequately. So Amy, I'll just mention the vitamin D. I tend to give high doses because most people, by the way, 70% of people are lower than the reference range, which is 30 to 100. So 70% of people are low, and probably 90+% are lower than the 60 that I would like to see them at. So I tend to give high doses. It comes in international units and it's over the counter, so people can take it. I tend to give 5,000 international units per day. And I watch the level over time. It takes a long time for you to increase the level to where you want it to be. So if you want to go from, say, 30 to 60, it may take you 6 or 9 months of taking 5,000 international units a day. Some of my patients end up taking 15,000 units a day, very high doses. If you go out in the sunshine, you can get about 25,000 units over an hour or so. So that's how we get our vitamin D, is in the sunshine. Years ago, we began fortifying our foods, mainly our cereal and our milk, because kids had low levels of vitamin D and they were having bone fractures and so on. But those levels are very small. If you look at your vitamin D fortification, they're usually about 400 international units. So I'm trying to get people boosted up significantly, so we're taking very high amounts. Now, something you should be aware of when you take high amounts of vitamin D is you should take it with vitamin K2. What? Why do we want to give another vitamin with vitamin D? Well, it turns out that vitamin K2 helps you because it prevents all the calcium that's being absorbed from vitamin D from going into your arteries, and it shunts it towards your bones where you need to build strong bones. And so the idea is if you take more than 2,000 international units per day of vitamin D, you really should take it with 100 micrograms of vitamin K2. And if all this sounds confusing to you, you do not need to worry because it's a common formulation out there. Just know that
I just want to mention that my PCOS Diva Super D has that formulation.
Perfecto. So all you need to do is listen to Amy about, how to take your vitamin D properly. But that's the reason why you're taking it. You're taking it for insulin sensitivity because you want your insulin to work better. And then you're also, if you're absorbing that calcium, you don't want it to go into your arteries. Why? Because you're probably building that small, dense cholesterol and you probably have a little bit of inflammation. So we don't like to give you calcium and have it go to the blood vessels. We want it to go to the bones. So if we do it in the right way, it will give you the best chance of insulin working better. Omega-3s, I love omega-3s. Why? Because they can actually help convert that small, dense cholesterol into the light, fluffy kind, so that's good. They can also reduce inflammation by up to 25%, so that's pretty awesome. And they improve your metabolism because omega-3s make up the cell membranes. So every cell has a wall around it. And that wall is what exchanges nutrients back and forth thousands, trillions of times per day. And if we can actually have a wall that's nice and flexible, it works a lot better than a stiff wall. We're all eating pro-inflammatory foods right now, the French fries, the onion rings, the potato chips. I'm getting hungry just talking about it. But all these pro-inflammatory foods can actually screw up our ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. And we really need to have a 5-to-1 ratio. You can see what your ratio is right now by getting a simple blood test. And the blood test will tell you if you're at risk or not. And that is available at the bottom of your page under nutrients. People can click on the nutrient tab and get their omega-3 testing done. Omega-3s are so critical to so many processes in our body that I love to give them as supplements. And so I don't know if you have a supplement with omega-3s, but I love omega-3s. They reduce inflammation. They can increase the HDL large, which is the most efficient type of good cholesterol, and they can actually change somebody or help to change somebody from a pattern B, which is the small dangerous cholesterol pattern, to a more favorable pattern A. So omega-3s are pretty critical, particularly when it comes to people that are suffering from PCOS.
Yeah, and I really think that it's one of the essential supplements. If you look at my essentials bundle, it's my multivitamin that has all of the methylated Bs that you're going to be talking about, and then the vitamin D and the omega-3 fish oil. I think that every woman with PCOS needs to be on those three things, and then the rest, it sort of depends on the symptoms that you're experiencing.
And again, 90% of people have a deficiency in the omega-3s. And so if you're out there listening, well, that's probably not me. If you go and you actually get the marker checked, you'll probably be surprised at how low you are. I hope you're not, but it's one of those things where we find it commonly. And so it's one of those super big bang for the buck type of nutraceuticals. And I'm kind of a believer that we don't want to be taking, a ton of nutraceuticals if we don't have to. It can be a waste of money. I'm also a big advocate of, if you do take a nutraceutical, you really should test and make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing in your body. Because if it does have the right composition to it, you should see the changes if you're compliant. And that really helps you because it makes it all worthwhile that you have control over it, because you're actually manipulating your numbers. And again, these are your numbers, so you are responding to your intervention. It's pretty cool. And then B vitamins, which you talked about, super critical for proper metabolism. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Vitamin D, I kind of hit this already, but 70% of Americans are deficient. Relative to PCOS, I like it because it increases the sensitivity of insulin. It also can increase the HDL, which is something that people need with PCOS because they tend to have the small dense cholesterol. So we want to remove the bad cholesterol from the lining of our arteries. And I mentioned some of these other: better control of blood pressure, less depression, improved neurological function. These are people that have neurological diseases such as MS. I just did an interview with Terry Walls, who was a survivor of MS. She took herself from a wheelchair to totally functional, riding bikes everywhere. And the idea here is that she super believes in vitamin D, and she has something called the Walls protocol for you to look into if you do have a lot of inflammation. We do see less autoimmune disease with high levels of vitamin D as well as less cancer, as I mentioned, and really good for bone building. So it can protect you from osteoporosis as you get older. Again, if you're taking it with that vitamin K2, which is going to take that calcium to build your bones and direct it into the bones themselves. So then omega-3 index, I kind of talked about this as well. 90% of Americans are deficient. You can tell quite quickly with the blood test on whether or not if you're one of them. If you do take them and you take adequate dosing, which I can talk about, but I like to take them because it lowers inflammation, it increases HDL, it can lower your triglycerides. In fact, the more omega-3s you take, the lower your triglycerides will go. It's a dose-dependent lowering of triglycerides. If you have homocysteine, which we'll talk about, it may actually lower homocysteine. And it's one of the few things that it can actually lower lipoprotein A. Remember, we talked about that as being the genetically inherited thing. 20% chance that all of you that are listening have it. You don't know about it. I would say 99% people don't know that they have it. So it's important to check for it. But it can lower it by about 10%, so that's nice. And then also, it can help people with PCOS because it can help you change from that dangerous small dense pattern of cholesterol that you tend to make with high levels of insulin and convert it into a pattern A. And again, it can help protect you from osteoporosis because it can lower the inflammation, which does disturb bone metabolism. So for women, super important to take omega-3s. And I love taking omega-3s. It's one of the things I'm actually compliant with really well because I understand that it really helps with a lot of my personal biomarkers. Magnesium, we also talk about this because, again, it's thought that about 80% of Americans are deficient in magnesium. We tend to measure magnesium by a test called red blood cell magnesium, and it will give you an idea of where you're at. But it's important because it can help you particularly sleep better, lower your blood pressure, help with depression, and a lot of people say they just feel less fatigue and they just feel better with magnesium. In the emergency room,
I just want to say one thing about the magnesium. You're saying 80% of Americans are deficient. And the number is that women with PCOS are 19 times more likely to be deficient in magnesium. And a lot of, and vitamin D as well. They're more likely than non-PCOS women to be deficient in
Yeah, so
vitamin
this
D.
is super important when it comes to
Yeah.
PCOS, just to recognize you're just a much higher risk. If you have PCOS, again, we're talking about the things that you know, sort of things to look at in your approach to it to see if you fall into these very common categories. Again, high insulin leads to high testosterone, a lot of vitamin D deficiency, a lot of magnesium deficiency, a lot of omega-3 deficiency. So by looking at this, and I hope many of you will actually listen right now, but also review this again. And as you get your own blood testing, and maybe you've had blood testing before, sit down with your tests and kind of look through the areas that you could improve on. And your test guide really helps for that because it gives them ideas of the ranges they need to be in.
So, Dr. Ellen, we have a question from Diana. She wants to know what your preferred form of magnesium is. Too much citrate gives her loose bowels.
Yeah, so magnesium glycinate is my preferred form. It is absorbed very well, and so I like to do that. You can do 400 milligrams at night. Magnesium citrate is used for constipation because of its effects that she's suffering from. But you know you're taking too much magnesium when you have really loose stools. But magnesium glycinate would be the one that I would recommend for her. It's also important for her to probably get a baseline magnesium test done just to make sure she's not currently overdoing it. Because sometimes we can take too much of these things, and sort of the side effect of making too much magnesium is we get diarrhea. But you can test this and you can know. So that's what I would say with that one. All right, anything else? You ready to move on? I'm having a hard time looking at these questions as we do this. Okay, so Maria is saying, I'm really looking forward to learning more about the labs we should order and how to interpret them ourselves, maybe even all by ourselves. Yeah, I always recommend that you learn as much as possible about your own personal labs and understand how you can fix them very naturally, but then work with somebody who is going to help you along life's way. You know, working with Amy is nice because she's an advocate for what you're doing. We, in our testing platform, we actually hook people up with a telemedicine lab consultation if they want to. It's not me. It has nothing to do with our company. It's with another company, another group of doctors. They're integrative doctors, and that's why we set it up that way. So if you want to talk to an integrative doctor about your lab tests and come up with a plan, you know, based upon their recommendations, you can do that as well. There's an additional cost, but it's very reasonable for seeing a functional medicine integrative doctor. At least here in Austin, they're very expensive to see. It's $500 to $700 an hour. These guys charge $197 for a telemedicine visit from anywhere in the world. So it's kind of cool. All right, I want to talk about MTHFR because MTHFR is sort of a hot topic. It's something I recently got tested on myself. And it can be somewhat complicated if we don't approach it in the right way and understanding of it. All right, so to the left here is some random guy that I picked out from, I don't know, Shutterfly or whatever, stock shutter or whatever it is. And then to the right is actually my grandma. This is a picture from her when we went on a cruise together. She's given a thumbs up. The idea here is that both of our parents give us this MTHFR gene. And MTHFR, what is it? It's actually an enzyme. And it helps us in many ways, but at the end of the day, that MTHFR makes methylated folate. And so some of us have a deficiency in that enzyme. And it's really important that we know whether or not we have a deficiency. Now, I'm 48 years old, and it took me 48 years to find out whether or not I have a deficiency in that gene. And the reason why we test for it these days is because it's a fairly common deficiency. And it sort of breaks down like this. When we go to the gene, MTHFR gene, you can either have a problem with 677 or a problem with 1298. Now, it just so happens that I have a 1298 problem, which the good news is that's not as severe as a 677 problem. Why do we want to know about this? Well, pretty common. But if you have a 677, you might have a significant problem. And again, 10% of the population has a 677 problem. This means that you have reduced enzyme activity by more than 65%. Even if you take folate in your diet, your levels can be quite low. You tend to walk around with elevated homocysteine. Homocysteine is an amino acid that when it's high, it increases risk for stroke and heart attack. And it also can increase your risk for developing cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and really all forms of cognitive decline. And so when we see somebody, and again, this is 1 in 10 people, when we see that they have reduced methylation abilities, overall, throughout their entire DNA, they're having trouble and they're struggling. And the idea is that if we know about it, we can do something about it. This is sort of the complicated pathway that we look at when it comes to methylation. So I tried to simplify the pathway as much as possible. So to the left here are all the foods and supplements that we may take. And you notice you have to have proper B vitamins in order to make the enzyme work properly, because there are cofactors in this enzymatic reaction. At the end of the day, we're trying to methylate. And so what is methylation anyway? Methylation is simply where we change one substance to the other. And our body does this trillions of times per second in our body. This is what we need for proper metabolism. We need to methylate. And if we're not methylating well, we tend to measure these high levels of homocysteine in our bloodstream. So if you have a 677T genetic defect, you are going to most likely have high levels of homocysteine, which will tell us you have a major problem with your methylation pathway. If you don't address this, you're just, in preventive medicine or functional medicine, we look at things as you're just running the risk of having Alzheimer's when you don't necessarily need to. Because we can fix this quite naturally by giving you methylated B vitamins. So we tend to give you methylated folate and methylated B12. And so the idea here is that if we know about it, we can actually have a much better outcome. So I threw this up there on our inflammation pathway in our Aging Well circle. It's up here to the right. Homocysteine is really an amino acid, but it is associated with inflammation and specifically with cognitive decline and early risk of stroke and heart attack. So you can measure this in the bloodstream. You can measure your MTHFR. You only have to do the MTHFR once. So I'm a 1298. Is that a big deal? Well, yeah, it means that I tend to struggle with methylation. So it's important for me to take B vitamins. I probably need to take a methylated form of folate and methylated form of B12. I've had people ask me, is it safe to take, B vitamins? And, the answer is yes. When it comes to B12, I always have people say, my B12 level is above 2,000, should I be worried? And I say, well, you don't need to take quite as much of a supplement. You can back down a little bit. But the truth is, I recently had somebody come in with cyanide overdose in the emergency room. And the dose that I gave him to save his life was 5,000 times the dose that we give in the anti-aging practice as a pill every day. And I gave it intravenously, just pushed it all at once. And it bound to the cyanide and formed a methyl cyanide complex that he was able to excrete in his urine and got out of his system. And so it literally saved his life. He was trying to kill himself from taking cyanide. I didn't know you could order cyanide on the internet on Amazon, but I guess you can. He ordered this big bottle of cyanide and he powdered for him, and he just took it as the powder. But the idea here is that B12 is very safe. So taking methylated B vitamins, super important to lower homocysteine, really important to know what you're doing in terms of your MTHFR status genetically. So it's awesome. Another really cool thing to know about is CRP. CRP, along with homocysteine, are inflammatory markers. PCOS people tend to have high levels of CRP, and they never know it because they never get it checked. This, along with small dense cholesterol and the sugar problems, can lead to early strokes and heart attacks, particularly as you go through the normal aging process. This can be measured. Optimally, we want it less than 1. We see it most commonly from 2 to 10 in our bloodstream when we have insulin resistance. As we fix the insulin resistance, the CRP number should get better. If we start to see that number above 20, we have to start thinking about underlying autoimmune diseases or underlying cancers that need to be picked up. Never get your CRP checked when you're feeling terrible, unless terrible is your baseline, because CRP can be elevated by simple infections. It can be elevated by a recent surgery or a recent injury. So the idea here is to get it checked when you're feeling your normal state of health and you haven't had any major event, because CRP is a natural inflammatory response. So we want to see it as when you're totally normal, whatever that baseline is for people. Some people feel great as a baseline. Some people feel terrible as a baseline. But the idea is get it checked when you're at baseline, not when you're having your seasonal allergy outbreak or when you're having some type of illness, because your CRP will be high and you'll not know what to do. So CRP is caused primarily here in the United States by massive sugar intake. To give you an idea of the scope of the sugar problem, the average American is taking in 150 to 200 grams of processed sugar per day. The World Health Organization wants us to take in 25 grams or less. So again, 25 grams or less, what is recommended for healthy people? Average American, 150 to 200 grams. That's why we're having so much problem with prediabetes and diabetes and so on. Prior to 1980, really didn't see any kids under the age of 20 with type 2 diabetes. They all had type 1, which is an autoimmune type. Nowadays, we're seeing 50,000 kids under the age of 20 due to type 2 diabetes. So it really is an epidemic out there. In regards to PCOS, watching your sugar intake is absolute key because it can lead to inflammation, and most commonly, it leads to that insulin resistance issue. So really cutting back on your sugar and really trying to get closer to 25 or even less is super critical. And I don't believe in counting very much because you can do it really well for a little while and then you just get tired of counting. So I always try to give people simple plans. And my first plan with anybody with PCOS is I say, in regards to the diet, I want you to start looking at labels and I want you to look for the word sugar and I want you to tell me how many grams of sugar you're eating per day. And I just have them do this for a few days or a week. And just to get a baseline, I mean, are you closer to 150 to 200 grams? Did you go through the drive-thru and order a Blizzard? Because I can tell you there's 140 grams in a Blizzard, and that's a small Blizzard, 140 grams of sugar. If you have one Coke, that has about 38 grams of sugar in it. If you upgrade and get a 20 ounce, that's about 70 grams of sugar. So I just want to get a feel for where you at in your daily routine. Are you closer to 25? Or are you closer to the normal for America, which is 150 to 200. And once I do that, I even get my kids doing this. It's awesome. My kids actually will look at labels. So again, this doesn't include any whole foods. We're not talking about fruits, vegetables, that kind of stuff. If you have a whole food, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about anything with a label. And so if you can just look for the word sugars and just get an idea of where you're at, and let's try to get that down to 25 grams or less. Because of these reasons, it causes inflammation, but it really causes problems with insulin. Our insulin has to pump out whenever we have sugar circulating. So if we have PCOS, we want to lower that insulin very naturally. So dietary intervention is huge. Other problems with inflammation are the American diet. We're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. We're all eating processed foods. We're eating too much pro-inflammatory omega-6s. Remember I told you 90% of us are deficient in our omega-3s. Omega-3s are quite anti-inflammatory. The omega-6s, many of them are pro-inflammatory. And again, trans fats, saturated fats, super inflammatory things. Dairy, gluten, and coffee for some people can cause inflammation. So when we talk about elimination diets, sometimes we'll start by getting rid of dairy. I start with that first typically and see how that affects things. If that works well, that's great. Gluten, much more difficult to stay away from gluten, requires a lot of discipline and not necessary in everybody. And so I don't start with that. I tend to start with dairy if I'm really looking at dietary reasons for inflammation. You can get food sensitivity testing done. You can get it done through our site too. It'll tell you your sensitivity to various things. It's an at-home kit. So we send the kit to your house and you test yourself and send it back. We use Meridian Valley Labs for that. They do the analysis and then send you a report. Then it will tell you exactly if you have low, moderate, or high problems with the dairy and gluten and so on. They test about 190 different things. So you can really pinpoint in your diet things that you may want to take a look at, either cutting back or eliminating. Now, I don't know, do you do a lot of that, Amy? Do you guys talk about food sensitivity or do much of that?
Yes. So I've done a podcast about food sensitivity that you can check out. And then I do have some articles. So you can just go to the search bar on PCOSdiva.com and look up food sensitivity, and you'll find those resources.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, it is kind of like a hot topic right now. What I'm kind of, just philosophically, what I'm kind of against is super restrictive diets, because what happens is with super restrictive diets, you end up training your bowel to be super restrictive. And that way you kind of paint yourself in a corner in what you can eat. So I like to be very reasonable. I have more of a pragmatic approach. Is let's try to let's do the food sensitivity testing and let's take it out for a reason, and let's just do one thing and let's see how that affects your numbers over time and see if everything's correcting on its own. Let's not try to take out everything Because when you take out everything, your gut gets used to taking out everything, and then you can't eat anything, and that's a horrible way to live the rest of your life. So I'm more pragmatic probably than other people in my approach. Is I try, just one thing at a time, the worst thing that it appears to be. So anyway, stress, another big cause of inflammation. The lack of actually sleep is super important to look at. So if a person's stressed, they're not sleeping well. Sleep, I love to talk about sleep relative to insulin resistance, so I guess I'll talk about that in a minute. Lack of exercise can cause inflammation. Over-exercise can cause inflammation. You got to exercise just right. Toxins, real common in our environment these days. We're seeing more problems with infections. If you have dental problems, of course, that's a really common cause. Particularly as we get older, we get gingivitis, and that increases our inflammatory markers over time. And then the number one cause of inflammation, in my experience, has been insulin resistance and being overweight. So as we lower insulin resistance, we can reduce our inflammation. Problems with inflammation are early stroke and heart attack. If your inflammatory marker is above 2, that's where the research shows. And as you go higher, your risk goes higher. Increases in autoimmune disease with inflammation, and then, of course, increases in hot flashes in women who are peri and menopausal. All right, so now we've talked about PCOS. We can get fooled, however, in thinking that PCOS is just our insulin resistance, when in fact we have an undiagnosed thyroid condition. And women are really high risk for thyroid condition. They develop thyroid disease 10 times more frequently than men do. And it's thought to occur because, a lot of women, get pregnant, and some of the baby's, material translocates across the placenta and into their bloodstream. They react to this abnormally, and they develop an autoimmune condition. Just so happens the thyroid is the most common autoimmune condition that people get. So this is an example of what a thyroid looks like in the neck. And so women tend to get this extremely frequently. Even Mona Lisa was thought to have it. A couple of doctors wrote a recent article about Mona Lisa saying that if you look at this picture, she has all the findings of hypothyroidism. She's missing the lateral third of her eyebrows, very common finding. She has thinning of her hair at the top of her head there, and then her hair appears to be fairly coarse as it goes down her neck. Her neck, the anterior neck, looks a little bit full, maybe a little bit swollen, and then her hands look like they're edematous. So these doctors were thinking that her iodine deficiency caused her to develop hypothyroidism. Again, this was just sort of like a, hey, guess what? Maybe she has this. The idea here, though, is times have changed. We don't suffer from iodine deficiency anymore. We almost always suffer from an autoimmune condition here in the United States. So here's somebody who came through our direct access platform frustrated because her doctor told her everything was fine, even though she had the symptoms of hypothyroidism. She was constipated, she was generally tired, she was depressed. Her doctor did a TSH, it was just under 4.5 or whatever, and told her it was normal. There was nothing more that she needed to do. Well, she had done some reading, and she thought, I'm going to do some more complete testing. I'm going to look at my antibodies, and I'm going to look at my actual active hormone, free T3. So the thyroid, interestingly, it makes 80% T4, which is inactive, and then it makes 20% active. So you may say to yourself, why does the thyroid make an inactive hormone? In fact, the most of the hormone that it makes is inactive. Well, it's because our body can actually take that inactive hormone, and it can either store it if it doesn't need it, or it can convert it into the active hormone. And this works well for most people. But about 15% of the population has trouble taking the T4 and converting it into the active form T3. And so in her numbers, they're a little bit on the lowish side. My optimal for TSH is less than 2. Optimal for T4 is above 1. Optimal for T3 is above 3. These are my optimal numbers.
Yeah, and I just want to say that most traditional doctors, that's not what their optimal numbers are. Maybe you could just explain kind of the difference between an integrative doctor's optimal and...
Yeah, for sure. So if you look at healthy populations, they really should be under 2 on the TSH. And in most integrative or functional medicine practitioners will admit that under 2, so 0.4 to 2 is where most people should be. If you talk to most allopathic doctors, even endocrinologists, if this is what they do, they just look at the reference ranges. You have to keep in mind the reference ranges include all those people that are already on thyroid medicine that are out there. And we've seen these reference ranges come down over time. TSHs used to go up to 9. But they've cut them back. Every few years, they cut them back when they realize that they're including a lot of really unhealthy people. So again, if a person's suffering from symptoms that are consistent with hypothyroidism and their TSH is even just a little bit high, advanced testing needs to be done. This person took advantage of it, and she actually got herself a diagnosis. She was able to take these numbers back to a different doctor and say, I've done some reading, I have positive antibodies, and from what I'm reading, it looks like I have Hashimoto's disease and need treatment. And sure enough, she's right, because when you have positive antibodies, it means that there's an autoimmune attack on your thyroid. And so she did have positive antibodies. The peroxidase antibodies are positive about 85% of the time. She also had thyroglobulin antibodies. They're positive about 60% of the time. So she was kind of, she came back normal on her thyroglobulin because it's not quite as sensitive a test. That's why you'll see most people test the antibodies called thyroid peroxidase antibodies, because they're more sensitive. They pick up the disease when it's not there. The interesting thing about Hashimoto's, Hashimoto was a doctor. He was a Japanese doctor who really discovered this autoimmune condition back in 1912. He was 31 years old at the time, and he was looking at the pathology. He was taking the thyroid glands of women who had been sick, and he was taking biopsies, and he would look and see this pattern that developed. And it wasn't until years later that they coined the term Hashimoto's disease after him. But he was very young when he discovered this problem. The idea here is that back then, it was not a very, very high prevalence problem. Here in the United States today, again, over 20 million people, mostly women, have this. And many of them are undiagnosed because they're only getting TSH checked. So for people who have PCOS, I always advocate for them to get a more complete look at their thyroid, which will include T4 and T3 and the antibodies, just to make sure that we're not actually dealing with a thyroid problem. Because guess what happens when we fix the thyroid? It fixes the insulin. And so now our insulin gets better. And what does that do? Well, that fixes our testosterone, so that gets better. And once we don't have that insulin resistance anymore, then our inflammation goes away. And then once we don't have that insulin problem anymore, we stop making the small dense cholesterol. So therefore, by identifying the thyroid problem and getting it fixed, we can actually fix all the things that are causing our risk for all this early disease. Why die from a heart attack when all you really had was a thyroid problem, right? And so the idea here is that by taking a comprehensive approach to this, we're not going to miss this problem. All right, so now I want to talk about the basics of hormones and proper testing. You can measure hormones via blood, urine, or swab testing. The best way, in my opinion, to measure the hormones of insulin and thyroid and fat hormones is through blood testing. And I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but you can actually measure belly fat hormones. You can measure something called adiponectin, which is quite anti-inflammatory. And you can measure something called leptin, which is pro-inflammatory. So I can tell you whether you're skinny or you're overweight, whether or not your belly fat is healthy. And there's plenty of people out there that are skinny, sick people who have really unhealthy belly fat. And those people tend to go on to develop PCOS. So it's really important to look at your fat hormones, and we can look at this through blood testing. Now, they tend to be a little bit more expensive to get fat hormones tested because it's like cutting edge and, of course, not covered by insurance, and not many people are looking at it, but it is available, and it's something that I test commonly in my patients because I want to know where we're starting from. Do we have a person who has healthy belly fat or not? Your belly fat is the largest endocrine organ in your body, and if it's not working right, it can lead to a lot of problems, a lot of inflammation. And I don't know if you know this, but the belly fat hormone, adiponectin, if it gets high enough, it can actually protect you from heart disease. And leptin, if it gets high enough, it can actually accelerate heart disease. So our belly fat can actually determine whether or not we go on to develop significant heart disease. And again, a skinny person can have unhealthy belly fat. What about female hormones? Well, you can measure female hormones in the blood as well. I tend to move towards Dutch hormone testing now. I don't know if you're a backer of Dutch, Amy, but it is something where I think price, if you look at price value, I think that the value is more so in Dutch because it gives you a lot more information when it comes to complete testing. So they'll look at all the metabolites of testosterone and estrogen and the adrenal hormones. They'll actually look at your adrenal hormones over time. The way the Dutch works for us is we use a company called Precision Analytical. It's a kit that's sent to your house, and you have to pee and get samples over four times during the day. And then you send it back, and then they give you an analysis of what it looks like. We do have a doctor who's an OBGYN here. He's an integrative OBGYN doctor that does telemedicine with people who want to have an OBGYN doctor who knows a ton about this stuff go over it with them via telemedicine and can kind of explain the results. The testing is very complicated, and it does take, it's not super simple to understand it. It really takes a really thorough understanding of it and explanation. So again, it's somebody that we refer people to, not part of our company, but we refer people to because understanding your Dutch really can help you understand how to fix the Dutch.
And I just want to say something. I did a podcast with a representative, a doctor, naturopath from Precision Medicine, Dr. I think it's Carrie Jones. And you can listen to that because that's all we talk about is the Dutch test, and go into detail with that. So if you want more information, listen to that podcast. Yeah,
and I would think that that would be a great thing if you have PCOS, is to really understand what's the most comprehensive way to get the hormone testing done. The only thing that I would say is that I use AM cortisol a lot as a blood test. And the reason why I look at AM cortisol is because the first thing, it's the get up and go hormone. It's what you like wake up and you get this rush of cortisol and you get like, okay, I'm ready to start my day. As you go to bed at night, that number should be nice and low. You should be nice and relaxed. Well, what's happening with many of my people who have insulin resistance is they have obstructive sleep apnea. And so the way that I screen for this is I check a morning blood cortisol test. And if that number is not high like it should be, if it's low, then that signals to me that they very likely have a sleeping problem, and we need to look very strongly at their sleep. And there are surveys that can be done. They're called the Berlin and Epworth sleep surveys. You can take those if you have low morning cortisols, and if they're positive, your insurance should cover a test to look and see if whether or not you have obstructive sleep apnea. And it's a technical test. You actually take this device home, you wear it for 2 nights, and then you take it back to the sleep doctor and they download the results and can tell you, yeah, you have mild, moderate, or severe, and here's how we need to treat it. And some people, they'll come back and it was normal, which is great. But I would say that obstructive sleep apnea is probably the most common thing that's missed when it comes to insulin resistance. If you have insulin resistance, we're doing all these other things. Maybe they're putting on metformin, maybe they're restricting all your sugar, they're doing all these things to try to help, and nothing's working. We probably missed the obstructive sleep apnea. It's causing your insulin to surge all night long, and that's a really bad thing for your body. So identifying obstructive sleep apnea, the way I do it is I do the blood test and cortisol in the morning. If it's low, then I do the sleep surveys on people, which Amy, I can give you a link to if you want to. It's a great thing to send people just so they fill it out. And if you're positive, 1 or more, you just take those into your sleep doctor and they'll, okay, yeah, your insurance will cover your testing. They'll send you home with the device and you can actually get a diagnosis. If you do fix obstructive sleep apnea, you can reverse PCOS. You can also have more energy for that person they've had before. By lowering their insulin, they can finally lose some weight, and they may get pregnant too, so their periods may normalize. So it is super important to not miss obstructive sleep apnea. And again, in our comprehensive approach to aging well, we don't miss it because we're thinking about cortisol and checking cortisol. It's not just about adrenal fatigue. When it comes to insulin resistance, it's more likely to be a sleeping problem, either not sleeping long enough or sleep architecture is messed up, or you have obstructive sleep apnea. The number one thing that's missed, I think.
That's such a great point. And women with PCOS are at elevated risk for it. And I could tell you so many clients who have gotten a CPAP machine and been diagnosed, it has literally changed their life. So great point. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, well, I've seen in clinical practice taking care of thousands of people. I will tell you, when we started really paying attention to not missing obstructive sleep apnea, we literally saved so much trouble for patients because they didn't go down all these unnecessary pathways that weren't going to work for them. They got the primary problem fixed and it reversed all these other things. And so to not miss that is key. And again, by looking at that wheel, and actually I can give you a copy of that wheel if you want to post for people just to look at, to think about how we approach things in a comprehensive way. It's super cool. And it's super cool for people to think about their own lives in all these areas that they can look at and monitor over time as they age. Dutch Complete, I kind of talked about this. It's really 4 to 5 dried urine specimens collected throughout the day. It does look at all the sex hormones and your adrenal hormones. So it will measure your cortisol over time. So it will show you your cortisol slope, which is really important. It's pretty cool if you're doing hormone replacement therapy, and it can also measure some neurotransmitter metabolites which they recently added on. Again, it's a kit that's sent to you, and then you send it back. If you, by the way, get any blood testing through us, we use Quest Diagnostic Labs. So if there's a Quest Diagnostic Labs near you, then that would be where you would want to go. This is the top of our homepage, yourlabwork.com. It is available in 46 states. The 4 states that don't allow it are New Jersey, New York, Maryland, and Rhode Island. The first thing you want to do is locate a draw station just to make sure you have access to the blood tests. If you want Dutch testing done or you want food sensitivity testing done, these are kits that can be mailed to you. If you live in one of these restricted states, those companies will have you sign a form that say you're not collecting it within those states. You have to actually go outside the state boundary and then pee in a cup over 24 hours, and then you can go back to your state. We will cover all the shipping costs of all the kits if the food sensitivity or the Dutch, and then we cover all the blood draw fees if you go into a Quest. So you don't have to pay anything other than the cash price. This operates completely outside the insurance market, and it's really set up for people who have high deductibles and people that want to take control of their health. They don't want to necessarily go to their doctor first to get blood testing requisition done. They just say, I know what I want, and I'm just going to go in and get it. You can, if you have a flexible savings account or a health savings account, you can ask us for a receipt for those, and you can generally get reimbursed by those accounts. If you have private insurance like Blue Cross or Blue Shield and you try to submit it to them, they will deny it because you don't have ICD-10 codes. You get ICD-10 codes. Those are diagnostic codes given to you by the doctor that's taking care of you to justify why you're getting the test. So again, this operates outside the insurance market with the exception of a flexible savings account or an HSA. Most people will save significantly, 50 to 80%. You'll see in most direct access sites. The reason for this is because of our national contracted prices, we tend to get them significantly discounted relative to what they're going to bill your insurance. And again, if you haven't met your deductible, you're going to be stuck paying the elevated cost for labs. And it's really hurting a lot of people right now, and people aren't getting lab testing done, particularly preventative medicine testing done, because they just can't afford it because their deductibles are high, and they don't want to spend $3,000 for preventative labs. So the idea here is that this saves people a significant amount of money. If you're a person with great insurance, if you work for Apple or Samsung here in Austin, you have great coverage, this may not be the best platform for you. However, having said that, we still have many people, and I have many doctors who come through this platform, many nurses, many health optimizers who just kind of know what they want, and they want to actually look at their own tests, and they're just curious. And so this is an opportunity for people to do that. Now,
so, hold on one second, Dr. Allen. Just to be clear, I know there was a question from somebody that lived in New York. She could go across state lines, like into Connecticut, and get her tests done at a Quest lab in Connecticut and still get these done, even though she lives in New York?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's not where you live, it's actually where the blood is taken or where you collect your own urine samples. And so the idea here is that if you do live in New York or New Jersey, and you're going to travel and visit somebody in one of the other states, as long as we know where you're going to go, we'll generate that lab requisition with that doctor in that state that we have for that lab requisition.
And same if somebody lived in Canada or somebody from overseas, as long as they're visiting relatives, they can do this while they're here in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we actually have somebody from Australia that ordered some blood work actually last night, and they're from Australia, but they really like the idea of what we're doing, and they were going to visit at some point, and they just went ahead and just ordered it so that they would have the lab requisition ready. The lab requisitions are good for 3 months. If you don't get your blood work drawn in 3 months, you can always email us at support@yourlabwork.com. and just tell us, hey, I haven't had a chance to get my blood work done, and we'll renew it for you, and then you have up to a year to use it. So it is something that people can take advantage of. We're really flexible about when they do it, and particularly when it comes to Canada and some of these other countries where they just they want to have it done, but they wasn't sure when they were going to travel and be there. We have a lot of people from New York, New Jersey who will end up going on a trip somewhere and get it done at that point. So the idea here is that unfortunately those states don't allow for direct access testing. A person does have to go to their own primary care doctor first, and their own primary care doctor gets the results and manages everything. they're fairly restrictive relative to the rest of the nation. And we do actually do blood draws in Puerto Rico, believe it or not. So this is your page here. What I love about your page is that it's the yourlabwork.com/PCOS Diva. What I love about this is that you include the free PCOS Diva Labs guide, which I tried to put up on my aging wheel, though, so that people can kind of put those labs in perspective relative to all the different areas. You hit every one of my 5 key pillars of aging. So I love what you are putting out there for people. When you do go to her site, you can look at the panels. She has created panels just for you guys. So Amy has made panels that she likes to see, and we've been able to discount those panels for you. And so you can get a thyroid panel, which is kind of like the one I showed you. It's the exact same one I showed you there for $125. Nutrients, there's some key nutrients that are super important there. Blood sugar and lipid markers, of course, you can get. Lipid is the cholesterol markers, and then the hormones and inflammatory markers. You know, if you don't want to take advantage of her specially priced packages, you can go down on the same page and order a single test at a time or bundle tests together. You can get a Dutch test, you can get food sensitivity testing done, and you'll see that when you go to her page, there's a calculator below that will just keep track of if you're on a budget or whatever. You can actually order your tests and keep within your budget by looking at the calculator below and order single tests at a time. You'll see how it works when you go to her page. If you do want to take advantage of her page and things that are going on, we created a $20 off coupon for you guys. It's called PCOS Diva 20. If you put it in all capitals, it works. If you put it in all lowercase, it works. So it's just PCOS Diva 20, and that's a coupon code for you guys. Amy, did you want to say anything before I start looking for some of these questions here? We've got like 99 messages here, so I'm not sure how many of these are questions or just comments. So, yep, you're muted, so I can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I think we addressed a lot of the questions. There was somebody had a question about the amount of omega-3s that you like to see.
Oh yeah, so I can just tell you, omega-3s. When I give them, I'm generally giving them after seeing a person's blood work. So if I see that they have multiple things that can be fixed with omega-3s, what I don't want to do is skimp on the omega-3s. So if they have high CRP, if they have low HDL, large cholesterol, if they have high triglycerides, if they have a pattern B, all these things that can be fixed by omega-3s, I want to give them at least 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams per day of omega-3s. In other words, I want to give them plenty of omega-3 fish oil. Omega-3s are generally very safe. A lot of people worry about bleeding with them. I think it's kind of a farce. I just had a friend of mine who had an intracranial hemorrhage. She was on a bicycle and fell. She's probably about 45 years old. She fell and had a bleed inside of her brain. And I put her on 12,000 milligrams of omega-3s per day. Not because I'm crazy, but because some of the leading researchers in the nation say that if you put people on high-dose omega-3s, they tend to recover brain function significantly. And her brain function was very poor. She really couldn't even say any words. She has like 5 or 6 kids, and so I'm like, oh, this is terrible. So we put her on this, and within a week, she's completely normal. So it's incredible recovery. The point here is that when they've done research and they've looked at people that are high risk for bleeding, whether it's people that get, like John Ritter, he had a thoracic aortic dissection and died from it. Thoracic aortic dissections that are operated on, that are on high-dose omega-3s, bleeding intra-abdominal and otherwise on high-dose omega-3s. The omega-3 dosing didn't lead to any more increased bleeding than they would have had otherwise. And so the European Union thinks that 5,000 milligrams per day is safe. Here in the United States, we're somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 milligrams a day. So in general, most people I start at 3,000 milligrams a day, even though I have some people on 8,000 or so, but I'm treating for very specific reasons. And so if you're just a consumer out there, I certainly wouldn't recommend going more than 3,000 milligrams per day without the guidance of a doctor who's going to be giving it to you for a specific reason. An example would be if you had some type of head injury and they felt like you needed more omega-3s, or if you had really super high triglycerides. Maybe your triglycerides were maybe 1,000 or 2,000, and we really had to bring down those triglycerides. genetics cause that high triglycerides. So no matter how good your diet is, you can't bring them down. So we give high doses of omega-3s to get those down to a more normal range. But 3,000 milligrams a day, that's my long-winded answer to that very specific question. But 3,000 milligrams a day. And don't be as scared of omega-3s. They're really great, and they're great for a lot of things. And remember, 90% of you are deficient in them anyway. If you don't know, just get the test done, and it will tell you. My wife has Lp(a) and a couple other issues, but otherwise she's probably the healthiest person I know. We monitor her omega-3s very carefully because they're going to help her over time. And even though she takes adequate doses, we still check and see if she's actually at optimal, because we really want her at optimal, not just at the normal range.
Mm. You know, I loved your comment about it's not worth getting these lab tests if you're not worth doing, you know, if you're not going to do anything about it. But look at all of the information that you have to really target your lifestyle plan when you have this test information in your hands, which I think is wonderful. So just if you could clarify, once you get your lab results back, how can you go ahead and work with somebody to evaluate your testing? You'll give people a phone number to call to schedule.
Yeah. So the way it works, I'll just tell you how the whole process works. So let's just say that you ordered some tests. You're like, okay, I'm going to do some of these tests. You could just go online to the Your Lab Work site. You would just pick and choose what tests you wanted. You just go through your link there at PCOS Diva. When you check out, what happens is we give you an immediate confirmation your order's been completed. And then for us, it's a manual process. We actually have to go into whatever company you order from. So if it's a blood test, we go into Quest, we go online, we order your test for you. And as a backup, we actually create a lab requisition for you with a doctor's name on it and the specific test you're going to get tested. And we send it to you in a secure fashion. So in other words, you have to open up with a password, and then you open it up, and then you print it out, and you take it with you to the lab draw station. You can either schedule, if it's a blood draw with Quest, you can either call them and make a schedule. I recommend scheduling so you don't have to wait. I never schedule when I get my blood work done. I just show up there with my lab requisition. I've never had to wait more than 10 minutes, but it's probably because I'm just lazy with scheduling. Scheduling will help you so that when you show up, they'll get your blood work done. You don't have to wait. Once the blood work's done, it takes anywhere from 2 to 7 business days, depending on what types of tests you ordered, for the results to come back. When they do come back, we send them to you again in a secure fashion with a link for the telemedicine integrative people. So if you want to talk to an integrative doctor, separate from us, an integrative doctor, it has a link there, and they click on it. It'll take you directly to their landing page where you can schedule your visit via telemedicine with that doctor. We've had some really good feedback with them. People felt like they got great guidance and a great pathway forward. So far, so good for that. So we do that. If you have a Dutch testing done, again, we have that integrative doctor here based out of Austin who does telemedicine consultations with you. So if you really want to talk to a doctor, you can do it via telemedicine, really anywhere in the world with these options. If you want to just take your labs and take it into your own primary care doctor, your own OBGYN doctor, whoever's managing your bioidentical hormone replacement or whatever you're doing, you're welcome to do that too, and that we highly encourage you to do that. Our doctors only get involved if we see a panic value. So if we see something, you need to immediately go to the emergency room. Our doctors do not do consultations on their own. They just order the lab tests and they review the tests for panic values. And so anyway, that's kind of how it works. So it's sort of a turnkey thing that you control. You control what tests you have and what you want to do for follow-up. We always recommend that, particularly if you have significant abnormalities, that you talk with your, talk with people about it that are physicians who can put you on a path forward that will really help you.
And another question about how often you should get some of like the nutrient tests done, maybe your vitamin D, magnesium.
Yeah. So in general, for most tests, whether it's the advanced cholesterol panel, whether it's inflammation, whether it's insulin resistance, I like for people to do something really well for 3 months before they get retested, unless it's thyroid problems. So if you have a thyroid numbers and they're kind of off and you're worried about it, I recommend you recheck your thyroid in a period of 6 weeks, because the thyroid is something you don't want to let go for a long period of time because it leads to multiple downstream problems. So if somebody, let's just say you have your thyroid testing and you're on thyroid medication and it's not quite right, you're going to want to wait 6 or 8 weeks and recheck again to make sure it's right, because the thyroid is something that you will see the changes happen fairly rapidly once you change doses or you start on medicine, or if you're just watching yourself to see if you're going to progress. If you don't pay attention to the thyroid, it can lead to downstream problems, largely depression and weight gain is what we worry about the most with people. The other stuff we can generally fix over time, but we hate for you to put on 10 or 15 or 20 pounds and you didn't have to in the first place if we'd have just kept a closer eye on it. 3 months is what I do for my patients, 3 months of doing things really well. And so blood tests are only meant as an adjunct to actually keeping a person compliant by them understanding what to do. So my son's a perfect example. If I tell him vitamin D increases fast twitch muscle fibers, he now is motivated. He understands why he's taking it. He'll take it and he'll recheck his vitamin D and make sure it's into the range where he's going to build more. So if you're willing to use it as an adjunct for your health, you're going to understand a lot more. This is why we get better outcomes when we're actively participating in our healthcare, whatever it is. If you understand why you're doing what the doctor recommended, you're going to get a better outcome because you're going to do it. So 3 months in general is my answer. One thing I did want to mention about the Dutch and food sensitivity testing, they are kits, as I mentioned before, that come to you. The process with that is, what happens is as soon as you order through our website, we will contact those companies and arrange for it to be shipped to you. Once it arrives at your house, you do the testing whenever you get a chance to do it and then send it back to them. Once it's sent back to them, the test will take longer than the blood tests. So they're expecting 2 to 3 weeks to get your results. So if you're thinking about doing a Dutch and expecting your results to be back in a week, it's pretty unrealistic. It's most likely going to take several weeks for it to come back. So from the time you order to the time you send it to them, once they receive it, it's a couple weeks. Same for food sensitivity. It just takes a little bit longer because their methodology is a little bit slower than the blood tests. Blood tests come back much quicker.
Well, this has been so much wonderful information. I mean, we've been together for 90 minutes here, and the time flew, but we had lots of great questions, and I hope we could have get to them all, but I think we're kind of having to wrap this up now. But we will be sending out a recording very shortly through your email. And as Dr. Allen mentioned, he's going to be sending me the actual files. So if you have any problems getting that in your email, just reach out to me at amy@pcosdiva.com, and I'll be happy to send that out to you directly.
I also want to invite everyone here, and I just put it on there, they can go to Facebook and join our private group called Lab IQ. We sent this up primarily for health coaches to try to hook health coaches up with integrative practitioners. It turns out that health coaches they're coming on like crazy, and the idea was to try to partner with them to actually advocate for people. But the advantage of maybe some of you guys going to the Lab IQ is that you can actually have access to integrative doctors who will come on from time to time and give presentations. We had Alan Christensen on there talking about thyroid disease, his approach to people who have positive antibodies and so on. Last week, this coming week, we're going to have Terry Walls on there talking about autoimmune disease and her battle with MS. So as each sort of month goes by, we're going to bring on different integrative practitioners. We had someone on there talking about the Dutch testing. And so, you know, it could be a potential resource for you guys, particularly if you have results in your hand and you're curious as to, you know, what to do with them, just for a chance to up-level your IQ when it comes to labs. So if you haven't joined it, you know, certainly reach out to us at Lab IQ. It's a private Facebook group, so we have to preview, but you're welcome to.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for taking the time out to really educate us about labs. This has just been, you know, such an informative webinar. And thank you, Divas, for tuning in to listen and really learning to be a diva and take your health into your own hands by being able to order your own labs. It's really exciting.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Amy. Really appreciate it. Appreciate everybody staying on today, and really look forward to pushing out more educational information to you. Okay, guys. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's